Me and Marcos have been working as lumberjacks for years, cutting trees in a remote part of the forest. The woods we usually worked in were dense and seemed endless, with trails that only someone familiar with the area could follow without getting lost. It was October, the air was getting colder, and the days were growing shorter. That morning, we decided to go deeper into the woods to find better trees, the kind no one had touched yet. We'd been walking for almost 2 hours when we came across a trail neither of us remembered seeing before. Curiosity got the better of us, and we ended up following it, thinking it might lead to a less explored spot. That's when we smelled smoke. At first, we thought it might be a wildfire, but soon realized it was different. The smell was fresher, like firewood burning recently. A few meters ahead, right in the middle of that isolated trail, there was a campfire still lit. The flames were low, flickering a bit, but the embers glowed bright. The strange part was that no one was around. Just a single set of footprints in the damp earth, leading away from the fire. The prints were clear, big boots, probably a man's, but the weirdest part, there were only footprints going one way. No tracks leading back, like whoever made them just vanished into thin air. Me and Marcos exchanged a look, not sure if we should laugh it off or be worried. But there was something about that silence, the kind of heavy silence that feels like it's whispering something you can't quite understand. We hesitated for a bit, not sure if we should stick around or turn back. Marcos was the first to step closer, poking at the fire with a stick. The log shifted, sending up a flurry of sparks, proving it was fresh. Maybe they went hunting. Marcos mumbled, but his voice sounded more like he was trying to convince himself. I wasn't buying it. No tent, no backpack, no gear, just that fire and those damn footprints. I moved around, checking the ground for more tracks, but found nothing. Not even animal prints. It was like everything had stopped in that spot, like time had held its breath. The woods seemed darker all of a sudden, shadows stretching long and strange between the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that whatever made those footprints was still out there, hidden just beyond the trees. I wanted to say something, to tell Marcos that maybe we should head back, but the words stuck in my throat. He kept looking around, his eyes narrowing. Who the hell makes a fire and just leaves like that? He grumbled. But neither of us had an answer, and the silence that followed felt almost suffocating. Marcos shrugged it off, trying to act like it was no big deal, but I could see the way his eyes darted around, never settling for long. I bent down to get a closer look at the footprints. The size was impressive, bigger than either of ours, and deep, like the person was carrying something heavy. But what caught my attention was how crisp the edges were. They couldn't have been more than an hour old, maybe less. I pointed it out to Marcos, but he just muttered something about hunters or campers, even though both of us knew nobody came out this far without making some kind of noise. We followed the prints for a few yards, just to see where they led. They went straight down the path, then veered sharply into the thicker part of the woods. That's when we saw it, a scrap of fabric caught on a branch, dark and stiff, almost like it was wet. Marcos pulled it free, frowning as he turned it over in his hands. It looked like part of a jacket, thick and rugged, the kind you wear when you're planning to be out for a while. That there was something off about it, a faint metallic smell that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I didn't want to admit it, but the first thing that crossed my mind was blood. Marcos must have been thinking the same thing because he dropped the fabric like it burned him, wiping his hands on his pants with a nervous chuckle that didn't reach his eyes. "Probably just an animal," he said, but his voice was too quick, too forced. Neither of us moved for a moment, just stood there listening to the wind sigh through the trees. That's when we noticed it. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the usual hum of insects. Just that thick, unnatural silence pressing in from all sides. Then came the sound, a faint crack, like a branch snapping underfoot from somewhere deeper in the trees. We both turned at the same time, peering into the shadows, but couldn't see anything. "We should head back," I muttered, already stepping away. But Marcos hesitated, squinting into the gloom like he was trying to spot something just out of reach. "Hold on," he said, voice barely more than a whisper. Before I could stop him, he started pushing through the underbrush, following the direction of the footprints. Cursing under my breath, I followed, every step making my gut twist tighter. The deeper we went, the harder it was to convince myself this was just some lost hiker or hunter. The trees grew closer together, their branches clawing at our jackets, and the light struggled to pierce through the canopy. The footprints, however, never wavered, straight and steady, like whoever made them had a purpose. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something watching us, but all I saw were shadows twisting between the trunks. Marcos didn't say anything, just kept moving forward, jaw clenched tight, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. Then we found the second fire. Smaller this time, just embers glowing faintly in a little clearing. No footprints leading away, just the same ones we'd been following. It didn't make sense. Marcos swore under his breath, kicking at the dirt in frustration. "This is messed up," he snapped, running a hand through his hair. I couldn't argue. 2 fires, 1 set of prints, and still no sign of anyone. It felt like we were being led somewhere, each step pulling us further from the trail, deeper into the silence. I opened my mouth to say we should turn back, but that's when I heard it, a low hum, so faint I almost thought I imagined it, coming from somewhere beyond the clearing. The sound was steady and unnatural, like a distant engine or some kind of machine buried deep beneath the earth. Marcos heard it too. I could tell by the way he froze, head tilted, eyes wide. We stood there, straining to hear, but the hum never changed, just droned on and on, setting my teeth on edge. It was coming from further down, past the clearing, where the trees were even thicker. Everything in me screamed to turn back, to drag Marcos out of there, but he was already moving toward the noise, footsteps slow but determined. I cursed under my breath and followed, every step heavier than the last. After a few minutes, the trees opened up into another clearing, this one larger and eerily neat, like the forest had been cleared on purpose. In the center stood a cabin, not the kind you stumble across abandoned in the woods, covered in moss and half collapsed. No, this one was different, walls solid, windows dark, door slightly ajar. The hum was louder here, vibrating up through the ground, making my legs feel unsteady. "This can't be right," I whispered, but Marcos ignored me, eyes fixed on the cabin like he was in a trance. Before I could stop him, he was crossing the clearing, boots crunching on the dead leaves, hand reaching for the door. I grabbed his arm, hissing for him to stop, but he shook me off without even looking back. The door creaked open under his hand, revealing nothing but darkness inside. No lights, no movement, just that hum, louder now, pulsing through the air like a heartbeat. Marcos hesitated for a fraction of a second, then stepped inside, disappearing into the shadows. Every instinct I had was screaming to turn and run, to get the hell out of there and never look back. But leaving him alone didn't sit right either, so I took a breath, clenched my fists, and followed. The air inside was stale, smelling faintly of earth and something metallic. I fumbled for my flashlight, hands shaking so bad it took me 2 tries to switch it on. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on bare walls and a floor covered in dried leaves and dirt, like no one had been there in years. But that didn't make sense. The fires were fresh, and the footprints led straight here. "Marcos?" I whispered, but my voice came out small, swallowed by the dark. No answer, just that hum, deeper now, coming from below. I swept the light around and stopped cold. There, at the far end of the room, was a trapdoor, slightly open, the edges darkened like something had been dragged through. And beside it, another set of footprints, smaller this time, barefoot, leading down into the black. My stomach dropped at the sight of those barefoot prints, the toes pressing deep into the dust, heading straight down into the trapdoor. They didn't look right, too long, with narrow heels, almost twisted. I backed up a step without thinking, my boot scuffing loud against the wooden floor. That's when I heard it, a faint shuffle like something shifting below us, followed by a soft tap tap tap, irregular and deliberate, as if someone or something was moving slowly, carefully, just out of sight. I whispered Marcus's name again, panic rising sharp in my throat, but only silence answered. The hum seemed to throb now, vibrating through the walls, rattling the door behind me. My flashlight trembled in my hand, beam flickering over splintered wood and dark stains that trailed toward the trapdoor. I couldn't make myself move closer, but I couldn't just leave Marcos either. I leaned forward, forcing one shaky step, then another, until I was standing at the edge, staring down into the pitch black. The stairs descended into darkness, but halfway down, my light caught on something pale, Marcus's boot, tipped on its side, laces still knotted. No sign of him, no sound. Just that boot, sitting there like he'd been plucked out of it mid-step. My breath caught, chest tightening so hard it felt like my ribs might snap. I gripped the edge of the trapdoor, fingers digging into the wood, but I couldn't force my legs to move. The hum was louder now, almost deafening, and beneath it, I swore I could hear something else, a faint, wet sound like fabric dragging over stone. My flashlight flickered, the beam spasming as if the batteries were dying, and for a split second, I saw it. A flash of something pale and wrong, too many joints bending the wrong way, slithering further into the dark. I stumbled back with a strangled gasp, dropping the flashlight. It clattered to the floor, rolling in a slow arc until it stopped, beam pointed uselessly at the wall. My hands were shaking so bad I couldn't even pick it up. All I could do was stare at that boot lying on the steps, the lace trailing limp into the shadows. I should have gone after him, should have called out again, but my throat was locked tight with terror. Then, from somewhere deep below, came a sound that turned my blood to ice. A low whisper, stretched and cracked, dragging out a single word, "Help." It sounded like Marcos, but warped and distant, like a recording played back too slow. That single distorted word sent a jolt of cold terror straight through me, rooting my feet to the floor. I knew I should go after him. Every instinct screamed that I couldn't leave him down there alone, but something about that voice was wrong. It echoed up from the dark in a way that made my skin crawl, like someone was imitating Marcos but didn't quite know how human voices were supposed to sound. The hum beneath it pulsed in slow waves, each one pressing heavier against my skull, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. I forced myself to move, snatching the flashlight off the floor with numb fingers. The beam shivered as I pointed it back at the trapdoor, illuminating the stairs, plunging into black. "Marcos?" I croaked, voice cracking. For a moment, nothing. Just silence and that awful hum. Then, from the darkness, the voice came again, clearer this time, but still wrong. "Help me." The way it stretched the words was all off, like someone trying to remember how syllables worked. My hands were sweating so bad the flashlight almost slipped from my grip. I took one step back, then another, pulse hammering in my ears, and that's when the trapdoor slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. I yelped, stumbling back and nearly dropping the light again. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might crack a rib. I lunged for the door, fingers scrabbling at the edges, but it wouldn't budge. It felt like something was holding it down from the other side, something heavy and immovable. I threw my shoulder against it, panic tearing through me, but it didn't give an inch. The hum was louder now, almost rhythmic, vibrating up through my boots, making my teeth ache. And then, through the wood, I heard it again. That awful whisper, so close it might as well have been breathing against my ear. "Don't leave." Me. I stumbled back from the trapdoor, my legs barely holding me up. That voice, it was too close, too desperate, but still all wrong. My head was spinning, the hum drilling into my skull, making it impossible to think straight. I turned toward the cabin door, ready to bolt, but froze in my tracks. The door that had been half open when we came in was now shut tight, no light seeping through the cracks. I hadn't heard it close. My throat went dry, fingers trembling as I tried the handle. It didn't move, locked. I slammed my fist against it, shouting Marcus's name, but my voice came back hollow, swallowed by the walls. No answer, just the hum, and beneath it, a soft scraping sound like nails dragging slowly over wood. I whipped around, flashlight beam jerking across the room, but there was nothing. No movement, no sign of where the noise was coming from. Then the light hit the walls, and I felt my stomach lurch. Scratched deep into the wood, barely visible beneath the dust and grime, were words over and over, carved with something sharp and uneven. "Don't listen. Don't follow. I does not him." The words covered every inch of the wall, crossing over each other, frantic and jagged, like someone had torn their fingers bloody trying to write them. My breath came short and fast, each inhale catching in my throat. I turned the flashlight to the floor and nearly gagged. There, leading away from the trapdoor, were more footprints, the same bare, twisted ones I'd seen earlier, but now there were dozens of them, crisscrossing in every direction, like whatever made them had been pacing, circling, and all of them led to the door I was standing in front of. The air turned cold, biting, and I swore I could feel something breathing just behind me. I whipped around, light flaring wildly, and for the briefest heartbeat, I saw it, a face peering up from the crack of the trapdoor. It was dark, half hidden in shadow, but the eyes were unmistakable, wide and staring, pupils blown and wrong. But it wasn't Marcos. Couldn't be. The skin was too pale, stretched tight, mouth hanging open in a silent, twisted grin that seemed to shiver with each pulse of the hum. I staggered back with a choked cry, but when I blinked, the face was gone, leaving only darkness and that suffocating silence. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, just stumbled back until my shoulders hit the wall, heartbeat slamming in my ears. The flashlight trembled in my hand, casting wild arcs of light over the walls, the scratches, the trapdoor. My mind screamed to get out, to kick down the door or break a window, anything to escape that awful pulsing hum and the memory of those eyes, too dark and too wide, staring up from the black, but my legs wouldn't move. It was like the cold had seeped into my bones, pinning me there, forcing me to listen to that muffled scratching sound that seemed to crawl up from beneath the floorboards. And then, slowly, the trapdoor began to open. Just an inch at first, then another wood, groaning under the strain. I was too frozen to do anything but watch as something slid into view, a hand, pale and wrong, fingers too long, nails cracked and blackened at the tips. It gripped the edge, pulling itself up with that awful, deliberate slowness, joints popping and creaking in the silence. My knees nearly gave out, bile rising sharp and bitter in my throat. The hum swelled, vibrating through the walls, the floor, my teeth, until it felt like my skull might split. The thing that pulled itself through wasn't Marcos. It wore his jacket, sure, but it hung loose and twisted as if something thinner and too tall was draped in his clothes. Its head lolled, neck bending at a sickening angle, and those eyes, black and empty, glistening in the beam of my flashlight. It smiled, or tried to, lips peeling back to reveal teeth too many and too sharp. "Help me," it rasped, the words stretching and splintering, voice wet and broken. I staggered sideways, finally forcing my legs to move, slamming my shoulder against the door with everything I had. The wood groaned but held, trapping me in that room with it. In desperation, I swung the flashlight, the beam slicing through the dark and catching on that face, a face that wore Marcus's features like a mask stretched too tight. It flinched back, movements jerky and unnatural, and for a split second, I saw something else beneath the skin, slick and pale, like muscle without flesh. I threw my weight against the door again, wood splintering with a crack that echoed through the cabin. One more hit and it burst open, sending me stumbling out into the clearing, cold air hitting my face like a slap. I didn't look back. Couldn't. Just ran, branches clawing at my arms, legs burning, the hum still thrumming in my ears. It felt like the trees themselves were closing in, the shadows shifting, twisting. I don't remember how long I ran, crashing blindly through the underbrush until I burst out onto the main trail. lungs heaving, vision blurred with panic. When I finally dared to glance back, the path behind me was empty. No cabin, no footprints, just endless rows of trees, dark and silent. But that hum lingered soft and distant, following me all the way back to the truck. I never saw Marcos again. Search parties combed the woods for weeks, but they never found the cabin, never found any footprints, not even a scrap of fabric. They chalked it up to a wild animal or him getting lost, but I know better. I quit the job, moved to a different town, as far from those woods as I could get. But some nights, when everything's too quiet, I swear I can hear it, that low, pulsing hum, just beneath the edge of hearing, and a whisper that sounds almost human, stretched and broken, asking for help. I stopped talking to everyone from back then. Couldn't handle the pitying looks, the questions, the way people tried to make sense of what happened. I could barely make sense of it myself. I started drinking more, anything to drown out the memories of that cabin, those eyes. Some nights, I'd jolt awake convinced I heard that voice outside the window, soft and warbling, dragging out my name in that awful, distorted way. I took to sleeping with the TV on, the noise a flimsy barrier against the silence. About a year after it happened, I got a call from Marcus's sister. She sounded tired, voice cracked from crying. They declared him legally dead, finally giving up the search. I didn't say much, just mumbled something useless and hung up, hand shaking so bad I almost dropped the phone. That night, I got blackout drunk, trying to bury the guilt twisting in my gut. I was the one who'd made it out. I was the one who left him behind, locked in that dark with that thing. A few months later, I got a package in the mail. No return address, just my name scrawled shaky and uneven on the front. I almost threw it out, but something stopped me. Inside was a single item, a boot, muddy and torn, laces still knotted. The same boot I'd seen lying on those stairs, half kicked off, dark stains soaked into the leather. I dropped it like it was red hot, heart hammering, eyes darting to the window like I'd see that twisted face peering in. I spent the rest of the night with all the lights on, hands clenched around the nearest thing I could find that might work as a weapon, ears straining for that hum. But it never came. I left town the next day, packed a bag and just drove, no plan, no destination, just miles of asphalt and gas station coffee, trying to outrun that awful silence. It didn't work. No matter where I go, no matter how loud I blast the radio or how many sleepless nights blur together, I can't stop hearing it. That slow, pulsing hum, rising and falling beneath everything, like the world's holding its breath. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see those footprints again, leading away from the fire, never back, dragging deeper into the woods. I don't know what happened to Marcos. I don't even know what I saw that day. But if you ever find yourself in those woods, if you smell smoke where there shouldn't be any or see a trail that feels too straight, too deliberate, turn around. Don't follow the footprints. Don't listen to the voices. Some things aren't meant to be found.